A woman found an abandoned dog and her puppies. You won't believe what happened next. The road lay empty, consumed by thick fog and biting cold. Through the frost on the windshield, Clara caught a flash of movement. An emaciated dog, barely clinging to life, huddling over a trembling heap of puppies. Her breath caught in her throat. Who could do this? She whispered, a cold fury rising. She knew in that moment there was no turning back. Clara had found them. Abandoned, helpless. And now, she was determined to give them a chance at life. It was a bitterly cold winter morning. The kind that burrowed into your bones and lingered long after you'd stepped back into the warmth of a fire. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down upon the snow-covered earth, and the air smelled sharp and metallic, a promise of more snow to come. Frost clung stubbornly to tree branches, shimmering like fragile glass under the pale morning light. Clara tightened her coat around her frail frame as she trudged through the thick snow, her breath turning into puffs of white mist. Her cabin, perched at the edge of Havenwood, sat cocooned in the icy wilderness, surrounded by dense woods that now stood silent under winter's heavy grip. The storm from the night before had left deep drifts in its wake, turning the familiar landscape into an unfamiliar white desert. 60 years of living in this small town had made Clara resilient to the brutal winters. But today, there was an unusual ache in her joints, a nagging reminder that age was catching up with her. Still, necessity demanded she brave the weather. The firewood pile had dwindled dangerously low, and she had no choice but to venture out if she wanted to keep the cabin warm through the night. As she reached the woodpile, Clara paused to catch her breath, her mittened hands resting on her knees. The forest loomed beyond, a blur of skeletal trees and shifting shadows. The cold gnawed at her fingers despite the thick wool, and she silently cursed herself for not stocking up earlier. She began stacking logs into her arms, each movement precise and practiced, when something unusual caught her eye. A dark, motionless shape near the edge of the woods, partially buried under the relentless snow. She frowned, squinting against the swirling flurries. It was hard to make out what it was, but instinctively she knew it didn't belong there. Curiosity prickled at the edge of her exhaustion. Abandoning the firewood, she adjusted her scarf and cautiously made her way toward the shape, her boots crunching loudly in the snow. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at her coat as she drew closer. Her heart quickened, not from exertion but from a growing sense of unease. The shape became clearer, a mound of golden fur, dusted with frost. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a dog, lying unnaturally still, chained to a weathered wooden post that jutted stubbornly from the frozen ground. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling with both shock and sorrow. The dog's body was curled protectively around a huddled cluster of smaller shapes. Clara's heart clenched as she realized what they were. Puppies. Tiny, fragile bodies pressed tightly against their mother, trembling as the wind whipped mercilessly around them. Their fur was matted with frost, and their pitiful whimpers barely rose above the howling wind. Clara knelt beside them, her breath heavy and uneven. She reached out a tentative hand, her glove brushing against the mother dog's fur. The cold stiffness made her flinch, but then she noticed the faintest rise and fall of the dog's chest. She was alive barely. "Oh, you poor thing," Clara murmured, tears stinging her eyes. "What kind of monster would do this to you?" The iron chain looped tightly around the dog's neck was cruelly embedded in her matted fur, the metal biting into flesh. The padlock fastening it to the post was thick with rust, a testament to how long it had been there. Clara's fingers trembled as she tried to free it, but the lock was frozen solid. The puppies stirred weakly, their tiny cries mingling with the wind. Clara counted 6 in total, each one more fragile than the last. Their wide, frightened eyes looked up at her with desperation and fear, and Clara felt her resolve harden. "You're coming with me," she said firmly, though her voice broke with emotion. With great effort, Clara unwound her scarf and wrapped it around the shivering puppies, cradling them close to her chest. The mother dog let out a faint whimper, but didn't resist as Clara began working on the chain again, her fingers numbing from the cold. Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Finally, with one last desperate tug, the chain came free. The dog staggered, nearly collapsing, but Clara caught her just in time. She was alarmingly light, her body emaciated from what must have been weeks, if not longer, of neglect. Clara's heart ached for the poor creature. "It's all right, girl," she whispered, her voice thick with determination. "You're safe now." Balancing the puppies in her scarf and supporting the mother dog with her other arm, Clara turned back toward the cabin. Each step was a struggle against the biting wind and the weight of her precious cargo, but she pressed on, fueled by a fierce determination. By the time she reached the cabin, Clara's face was numb, and her arms ached from the effort. She kicked open the door, the warm glow of the fireplace wrapping around her like a lifeline. Carefully, she laid the mother dog on a soft blanket near the fire, arranging the puppies around her. They burrowed instinctively into her side, their trembling slowly easing as the warmth began to seep in. Clara knelt beside them, her breath heavy from exertion. The mother dog stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. Their gazes met, a fleeting connection filled with unspoken gratitude and trust. "You're safe now," Clara said softly, tears slipping down her weathered cheeks. "No one will ever hurt you again." The door of the cabin swung shut with a loud thud behind Clara, sealing out the bitter cold. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. The sharp scent of pine logs mingled with the faint aroma of spiced tea from the cup she'd left unfinished on the table. But there was no time for comfort now. Her entire focus was on the frail mother dog and her trembling pups nestled within her scarf. Clara's breath came in labored gasps, each puff a reminder of the exertion it had taken to carry them through the snowstorm. Her arms ached, and her legs felt like lead, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had brought them to safety. Gently, she knelt by the fireplace, her joints protesting with a sharp pang. She unwrapped the scarf, revealing the 6 tiny puppies huddled together, their fragile bodies still shivering despite the warmth beginning to seep into the room. Their fur, matted with frost, glistened under the flickering light of the fire. The mother dog lay motionless on the blanket Clara had hastily spread near the fire. Her golden coat, once likely beautiful, was now dull and tangled with dirt and ice. Her ribs jutted out sharply, and her breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest a struggle. Clara's throat tightened at the sight. She had seen hardship in her life, but this kind of suffering, abandonment and neglect, stirred a deep anger within her. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No one's going to hurt you again." She reached out a tentative hand, brushing her fingers gently over the mother dog's head. The dog flinched slightly but did not have the strength to pull away. Clara's heart ached at the instinctive fear etched into the poor creature's body language. "It's okay, girl," Clara murmured softly. "I'm here to help." The puppies let out faint, pitiful whimpers, their tiny bodies still trembling. Clara knew they needed warmth and nourishment immediately. She stood with purpose, her exhaustion forgotten. From the small cabinet near the sink, she fetched a thick woolen blanket and returned to the fireplace. Gently, she wrapped the puppies together, their shivering slowly easing as the warmth enveloped them. The mother dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, deep brown pools filled with exhaustion and pain. Clara met her gaze, a silent promise passing between them. "I'll take care of them," Clara assured her. "You just rest." She hurried to the kitchen, her mind racing. Warm milk, that's what the puppies needed. She filled a small pot with milk and placed it on the stove, heating it gently until it was just warm to the touch. Pouring the milk into a shallow dish, she carried it back to the fire. One by one, Clara coaxed the puppies toward the dish, their tiny tongues darting out hesitantly. At first, they were too weak, their movements sluggish, but Clara persisted, guiding their fragile bodies and encouraging them softly. Slowly, they began to lap at the milk, their instincts kicking in despite their exhaustion. "That's it," Clara encouraged, her voice gentle. "Good pups." As they fed, a faint glimmer of life returned to their tiny forms. Their whimpers grew stronger, and Clara felt a surge of relief wash over her. Turning her attention back to the mother dog, Clara knew she couldn't neglect her. The poor creature had likely gone without food for days, if not longer. Clara fetched a bowl of water and a small portion of boiled chicken from the previous night's dinner. "Come on, girl," she coaxed, setting the bowl near the dog's muzzle. "You need to eat." The dog sniffed weakly at the food but made no move to eat. Clara's chest tightened. "Please," she whispered. "You have to try." With trembling fingers, she shredded the chicken into smaller pieces and brought one to the dog's mouth. After a moment's hesitation, the dog took the morsel, chewing slowly. Encouraged, Clara continued feeding her bit by bit until the bowl was empty. "That's a good girl," Clara praised softly. "You're stronger than you think." The fire crackled warmly, casting flickering shadows across the room. The puppies, now full and drowsy, nestled together under the blanket, their tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful sleep. The mother dog, too, seemed more at ease, her breathing steadier as she lay protectively near her pups. Clara sat back on her heels, her breath shuddering with relief. They were safe for now. But questions swirled in her mind, dark and unsettling. Who had left them out there in such brutal conditions? And why? The chain around the mother dog's neck had been cruelly tight, the padlock rusted but sturdy. Someone had meant for her to stay there, meant for her to die there. Clara's fists clenched at the thought. "No one deserves that," she muttered under her breath. As the firelight danced across the room, Clara made a silent vow. She would protect them no matter what it took. They had already endured too much, and she wouldn't let them suffer again. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, there was peace. Clara watched over the little family, her heart swelling with a fierce determination. They had found shelter, and perhaps, just perhaps, they had found a new beginning too. The first night passed in a quiet but fragile peace. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls of Clara's cabin. The puppies, full from their first proper meal in who knew how long, lay curled together under the thick blanket Clara had wrapped them in. Their tiny bodies rose and fell with soft, contented breaths. Beside them, the mother dog, whom Clara had already started calling Grace in her mind, lay motionless, her body curled protectively around her pups. The faint rise and fall of her chest was a fragile promise of life. Clara sat nearby in her rocking chair, a steaming mug of tea clasped in her hands. She couldn't bring herself to leave them just yet. Her gaze drifted to the frost-covered windowpane, where the wind howled relentlessly outside, rattling the glass. The storm had buried the world in white, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, fragile but growing. Clara sighed, her breath mingling with the steam rising from her cup. "They're fighters, just like you," she murmured softly, glancing at Grace. The dog's ears twitched faintly at the sound of Clara's voice, though her eyes remained closed. As the hours wore on, exhaustion finally tugged at Clara's eyelids. She set her mug down on the side table and rose from the chair, her joints protesting the movement. She fetched a soft quilt from the back of the couch and draped it over the sleeping dogs, her hand lingering briefly on Grace's thin frame. "You'll be all right," Clara whispered, more to herself than to the dog. "We all will." The next morning dawned cold but clear, the storm having finally passed. Sunlight filtered through the frost-laced windows, casting golden patches across the floor. Clara stirred from her place on the couch, blinking blearily as the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, her gaze darting to the hearth. Relief flooded her as she saw the little family still nestled together, safe and warm. The puppies stirred, letting out soft whimpers as they wriggled against each other. Grace lifted her head weakly, her brown eyes meeting Clara's. "Well, good morning," Clara said softly. Her voice warmed despite the ache in her bones. "Looks like you made it through the night." Grace's tail thumped weakly against the blanket, a faint but hopeful gesture. Clara's heart lifted at the sight. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" she murmured, kneeling beside the dog. "Just like your little ones." The puppies, sensing movement, began to wriggle and yip softly. Clara chuckled, her fingers brushing gently over their tiny heads. All right, she said. Breakfast is coming. She rose to her feet, her joints creaking in protest, and made her way to the kitchen. As she warmed milk on the stove, she glanced back at Grace and the pups. The scene filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Since her husband's passing, the cabin had felt empty, echoing with memories of laughter and shared stories that now seemed like distant echoes. But now, there was life here again, fragile but determined. And Clara knew she would do whatever it took to nurture that life. Returning to the hearth with the warm milk, Clara carefully set the dish down. The puppies eagerly lapped at the milk, their tiny tails wagging furiously. Grace watched them with weary but loving eyes. You did a good job keeping them alive out there, Clara said softly, her gaze steady on Grace. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. Over the next few days, a routine began to form. Clara devoted herself entirely to the care of Grace and the puppies. She fed them regularly, cleaned up after them, and ensured the fire never went out. The cabin, once quiet and lonely, was now filled with the soft sounds of puppy paws scampering across the floor and the occasional bark or yip. Grace's condition slowly improved. Her ribs were still painfully visible, and her movements were sluggish, but there was a newfound light in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. She began to eat more, accepting the boiled chicken and rice Clara prepared with growing enthusiasm. You're getting stronger, Clara remarked one afternoon, watching as Grace stood up to nuzzle one of her pups. That's a good girl. The puppies, meanwhile, were thriving under Clara's care. Each one had a distinct personality that began to emerge as they grew stronger. The largest of the litter, a boisterous little male with a tuft of fur that always stood up, was the first to venture beyond the safety of the blanket. Clara laughed as he tumbled clumsily across the floor, his tiny legs struggling to keep up with his boundless energy. You're a brave one, aren't you? She said, scooping him up into her arms. I think I'll call you Buddy. The name suited him, and soon each puppy had a name to match their budding personalities. Max was curious and adventurous, always poking his nose into corners he shouldn't. Sunny and Daisy, the two females, were inseparable, their tails wagging in unison as they played. Lucky and Milo, the smallest but most mischievous, had a knack for getting into trouble, whether it was knocking over a bowl of milk or tugging at Clara's knitting yarn. You're a handful, all of you, Clara said one evening, watching the puppies wrestle on the rug. But I wouldn't have it any other way. Despite the joy the puppies brought, Clara's concern for Grace lingered. The mother dog was strong, but the toll of her past hardships was evident. Clara often sat beside her in the quiet hours of the evening, gently stroking her head. You've been through so much, Clara murmured. But you're safe now. We're all safe. Grace's eyes, filled with gratitude and trust, met Clara's. In those moments, words felt unnecessary. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Clara and Grace deepened. The dog, once wary and fearful, now sought out Clara's presence, resting her head on the woman's lap and wagging her tail at the sound of her voice. One afternoon, Clara decided it was time for Grace to experience the outdoors again. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath. The air was crisp but gentle, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Come on, girl, Clara said, fastening a makeshift leash around Grace's neck. Let's get some fresh air. The puppies bounded ahead, their tiny paws leaving tracks in the soft snow. Grace moved slowly but steadily, her steps careful. Clara stayed close, offering support with gentle words of encouragement. The woods were peaceful, the only sounds the rustle of branches and the joyful yips of the puppies. Clara's heart swelled as she watched them play, their energy boundless. Grace paused, sniffing the air and letting the breeze ruffle her fur. You remember this place, don't you? Clara said softly. It's different now, though. Safer. They wandered through the woods for a while, the sunlight filtering through the trees casting dappled patterns on the ground. When they returned to the cabin, Grace's tail wagged faintly, a sign of contentment that filled Clara with hope. You're going to be all right, Clara said, her voice steady. We all are. Time passed, and the little family thrived. The puppies grew stronger and more adventurous, their antics filling the cabin with laughter. Grace, though still thin, had regained a sense of dignity and strength. Clara often marveled at the transformation. What had once been a scene of despair and abandonment had become one of hope and renewal. The bond she had formed with Grace and the puppies was unlike anything she had experienced before. They had filled the void in her heart, bringing light to the darkest corners of her life. One evening, as the fire crackled warmly, Clara sat with Grace by her side. The puppies were curled up together, their tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful sleep. "You've changed everything," Clara said softly, her hand resting on Grace's head. "I thought I was done living, but you've shown me there's still so much to fight for." Grace let out a contented sigh, her eyes closing in peaceful trust. Clara smiled, her heart full. The journey wasn't over, there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Clara felt ready to face them. Because love, she had learned, was the strongest bond of all. The snow had begun to thaw, and with it, Clara's world grew warmer, not just in weather but in spirit. The puppies, now stronger and bolder, filled the cabin with life. Their soft yips and scampering paws were a delightful soundtrack to Clara's days. Grace, though still frail, seemed happier, her eyes brighter as she watched her little ones explore every nook and cranny of the cabin. Despite the joy that had found its way back into her home, Clara couldn't shake the lingering questions. Who had left Grace and her pups chained in the blizzard? And why? The collar around Grace's neck, weathered and scarred, hinted at a past that Clara was desperate to understand. One crisp afternoon, Clara decided it was time to remove the collar. It had been a symbol of Grace's suffering, and now it was time to let it go. Sitting by the fire, Clara gently coaxed Grace to lie down beside her. "You've carried this burden long enough," Clara murmured, her fingers brushing gently against the worn leather. "Let's set you free from it." Grace, ever trusting now, lay still, her deep brown eyes watching Clara with quiet understanding. The collar was old and cracked, the metal buckle rusted from exposure to the elements. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she unfastened it, the leather stiff under her fingers. With a final tug, the collar came free. "There," Clara said softly, holding the collar in her hands. "No more chains, Grace." The dog nuzzled Clara's hand, as if in gratitude, before settling back down with a contented sigh. Clara turned the collar over in her hands, her thumb tracing the cracks and scars. That's when she felt it, a small, uneven ridge along the inside lining. Frowning, Clara brought the collar closer to the firelight. There was a slit in the leather, barely noticeable but definitely there. Her curiosity piqued. Clara carefully pried it open with her fingernail. Something thin and folded was tucked tightly inside. "What on earth?" she murmured, gently pulling the object free. It was a piece of paper, worn and fragile, the edges frayed from time and wear. Clara's heart raced as she unfolded it carefully, the ink smudged but still legible. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, as though written in desperation. "I am a poor old woman who has just lost my home because I couldn't afford the rent. I now live in an old truck and can't take care of Grace and her puppies in this terrible weather. I had no choice but to leave them here near your house because I know you are kind. Please forgive me and save them." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words painted a vivid picture of a woman forced into unimaginable hardship, making an impossible choice. She imagined the desperation, the bitter cold gnawing at both flesh and spirit, and the heart-wrenching decision to leave behind a beloved dog and her pups in the hopes that someone, anyone, would find them and offer them safety. Tears blurred Clara's vision as she read the letter again, each word cutting deeper into her heart. This wasn't cruelty. This wasn't abandonment born of neglect or malice. It was an act of love, born out of sheer desperation. "Oh, Grace," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "She didn't leave you because she didn't care. She left you because she loved you too much to watch you suffer." Grace lifted her head at the sound of Clara's voice, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. Clara gently stroked her head, the letter trembling in her other hand. "I'm so sorry," Clara murmured, "for all of it. But you're safe now, and I'll make sure you stay that way." Clara sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the letter heavy in her hands. Her mind filled with images of the woman, alone, cold, and overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for Grace and her 6 tiny puppies in the harshest of conditions. The thought was almost unbearable. She imagined the woman standing in the snow, tears freezing on her face as she chained Grace to the post, whispering desperate apologies and prayers that someone kind would find them. Clara's heart ached at the thought. After carefully refolding the letter, Clara placed it on the mantel above the fire. It would stay there, a testament to the woman's sacrifice and the trust she had placed in Clara. "That trust won't be misplaced," Clara vowed quietly. The discovery of the letter ignited a deeper sense of purpose in Clara's heart. She wasn't just caring for Grace and the puppies. She was fulfilling a promise spoken through the words of a desperate woman. That evening, as the fire crackled warmly, Clara sat with Grace by her side. The puppies, now full of energy, tumbled over one another in a playful heap. The cabin, once silent and filled with shadows, was now a haven of warmth and life. "You've brought more to this place than I ever thought possible," Clara said softly, her gaze on Grace. "And I'll make sure you and your pups have the life you deserve." Grace nuzzled Clara's hand, as if acknowledging the promise. The next morning, Clara took action. She wrote her own letter, her handwriting steady but filled with emotion. "To the woman who wrote that letter, I want you to know that Grace and her puppies are safe. Grace is loved, and her puppies are thriving. I will make sure they have the life they deserve. Thank you for trusting me to care for them. I promise I won't let you down." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she wrote, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude and resolve. Clara placed the letter beside the original on the mantel, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She was part of something bigger now, a story that had started long before Grace and her puppies arrived at her door, and she would honor that story with every ounce of love and care she had to give. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Clara looked over at Grace and the puppies, their small bodies curled together in peaceful slumber. Despite the challenges ahead, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Grace and her family were no longer abandoned. They were home. Word of Clara's act of kindness spread slowly at first, carried by the whispers of neighbors and the occasional visit from curious townsfolk. Havenwood was a small town where news traveled organically, like leaves swept up in the autumn wind. What started as a quiet story of compassion soon became a tale that touched the hearts of nearly everyone in the community. It all began with Millie, the warm-hearted owner of the town's only bakery. Millie had been Clara's friend for years, often dropping by with a fresh loaf of bread or a slice of her famous apple pie. When she heard about Grace and the puppies, Millie insisted on visiting the cabin. "Clara, what have you gotten yourself into?" Millie exclaimed as she stepped into the cozy warmth of the cabin, shaking snow from her boots. Her gaze landed on the playful puppies tumbling over one another near the fire. "Oh my goodness! Look at them!" Clara chuckled softly, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. "They've been keeping me busy, that's for sure." Millie knelt down, her eyes softening as she reached out to stroke Grace's head. The mother dog, who had once flinched at every touch, now leaned into Millie's hand with quiet trust. "She's a beauty," Millie murmured. "And those pups. What a handful. They're a blessing," Clara admitted, her voice warm. "But it hasn't been easy. Keeping them fed, cleaning up after them, trips to the vet. It's a lot." Millie's brows furrowed with concern. "You shouldn't have to do it all alone, Clara. Why didn't you ask for help?" Clara shrugged, her lips curving into a wry smile. "You know me, Millie. I'm used to taking care of things myself." "Well, that's going to change," Millie declared firmly. "Havenwood takes care of its own, and that includes you." The next morning, Millie made good on her promise. At the bakery, she set up a donation jar with a hand-drawn sign that read, "Help Grace and her puppies thrive." The jar quickly filled with coins, bills, and handwritten notes of encouragement from townsfolk who had been moved by the story of Clara's unexpected family. One note read, Thank you for showing us that kindness still matters. Another simply said, for the brave mama dog and her beautiful pups. Stay strong. Millie didn't stop there. She made it her mission to spread the word, sharing the story with every customer who walked through the bakery's door. Soon, donations poured in not just from Havenwood but from neighboring towns as well. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Clara began to notice a steady stream of visitors. It started with Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived down the road. She arrived with a bag of dog food and a warm smile. I heard about what you've been doing, Clara, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice gentle. Thought I'd bring this by to help out. Clara's heart swelled with gratitude. Thank you, Ruth. That's so thoughtful of you. Next came young Tommy and his mother, carrying a handmade blanket for Grace. Mom said every dog deserves a warm place to sleep, Tommy announced proudly as he handed over the blanket. Clara knelt down to meet his gaze. You're absolutely right, Tommy. Thank you so much. The visits became more frequent, each one a reminder that Clara was no longer alone in her efforts. Neighbors brought supplies, offered to help with the puppies, and stayed to share stories by the fire. The once quiet cabin buzzed with life and laughter. One chilly afternoon, Millie arrived with exciting news. We're organizing a community playdate for the puppies at the town park, she announced, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. It'll give them a chance to run around, and I think it'll be good for you too, Clara. Clara hesitated. Oh, I don't know, Millie. What if they get overwhelmed? Nonsense, Millie said firmly. They'll love it, and so will you. The playdate turned out to be a resounding success. Families gathered at the park, bundled in coats and scarves, while the puppies tumbled through the snow, their boundless energy drawing laughter from children and adults alike. Grace watched from a cozy blanket Clara had spread out for her, her tail wagging faintly at the joyful scene. Clara's heart swelled as she saw the puppies chasing after one another, their tiny bodies leaving trails in the snow. For so long, she had lived in quiet solitude, her world confined to the walls of her cabin. But now, surrounded by laughter and love, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. Millie sidled up beside her, a smug smile on her face. Told you this was a good idea, Clara chuckled. You were right. Thank you, Millie. That's what friends are for, Millie said warmly. The community's support continued to grow. One of Clara's neighbors, a carpenter named Frank, built a sturdy puppy gate to keep the little ones safe inside the cabin. A retired seamstress volunteered to sew warm blankets for Grace and the pups. Even the local veterinarian, Dr. Emily Carter, offered her services at a reduced cost, ensuring that Grace and the puppies received the best care possible. During a community meeting at the bakery, Millie proposed another idea. We all know Grace's time is limited, she said, her voice steady but emotional. Why don't we make a bucket list for her? Let's give her the joy and love she's missed out on before it's too late. The room buzzed with excitement as neighbors brainstormed ideas. Clara sat quietly, overwhelmed by the love and support radiating from the people around her. By the end of the meeting, they had created a list of simple, meaningful activities to give Grace the happiest days of her life. A peaceful walk through the snow-covered woods, a cozy picnic by the fire with her puppies, a playdate for the puppies at the town park, a special roast chicken dinner just for Grace, a family photo session to capture their bond forever. The first item on the list was a snowy walk through the woods. On a crisp, clear morning, Clara bundled herself up and placed a warm coat over Grace. The 6 puppies bounded ahead, their tiny paws leaving tracks in the untouched snow. Grace moved slowly, her steps careful but deliberate. The woods were peaceful, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the joyful yips of the puppies. Grace paused frequently, sniffing the air and letting the crisp winter breeze ruffle her fur. You remember this place, don't you? Clara said softly. It's different now, though. Safer. As they reached a small clearing, Clara knelt beside Grace, her hand resting gently on the dog's back. This is your place now, Clara said quietly. Peaceful, safe, and filled with love. Grace leaned into Clara's touch, her brown eyes filled with quiet contentment. The next item on the bucket list was the cozy indoor picnic. Millie and several neighbors helped Clara prepare for the event, bringing everything from freshly baked bread to blankets and pillows to create a warm, inviting space near the fireplace. Clara made sure Grace had a prime spot by the fire, where she could rest comfortably while the puppies played nearby. Millie roasted a chicken to perfection, and when it was placed before Grace, her tail wagged furiously for the first time in weeks. "She's happy," Millie whispered, her eyes glistening with emotion. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "She deserves this." As the picnic turned into an impromptu gathering, laughter filled the cabin. The puppies tumbled over one another, their playful antics drawing smiles and cheers from everyone present. The community engagement transformed not only Grace and the puppies' lives, but also Clara's. Her once quiet, solitary existence had blossomed into one filled with love, connection, and purpose. Grace, once abandoned and forgotten, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Her story inspired everyone who heard it, reminding them of the power of compassion and the importance of coming together to help those in need. As Clara sat by the fire one evening, Grace resting peacefully at her feet, she reflected on all that had happened. The people of Havenwood had become more than neighbors, they were family. "You've brought us all together, Grace," Clara whispered, stroking the dog's head. "And you've reminded us all of what really matters." Grace opened her eyes briefly, nuzzling Clara's hand before letting out a contented sigh. Outside, the snow fell softly, but inside the cabin glowed with warmth, love, and the unbreakable bond between a small town and one extraordinary dog. The soft light of a winter afternoon streamed through the cabin windows, casting golden patches across the wooden floor. The fire crackled steadily, warming the room filled with the gentle sounds of playful yips and scuttling paws. Grace, the golden retriever who had once been a fragile shadow of herself, lay peacefully on a thick blanket by the hearth, her watchful eyes never straying far from her 6 spirited puppies. Though Grace had grown weaker in recent weeks, her spirit remained strong, fueled by the love and care she received. Clara knew their time together was drawing to a close, but instead of sadness, she felt a fierce determination. If Grace's remaining days were limited, they would be filled with joy, love, and memories that would never fade. The townsfolk of Havenwood had rallied around Clara and her unexpected family. With their support, the Grace bucket list had taken on a life of its own, each item a promise to create beautiful final memories for the brave dog who had endured so much. One crisp morning, Clara bundled herself in a thick coat and gently wrapped Grace in a soft, woolen blanket. The puppies, now full of energy and curiosity, bounded ahead, their tiny paws leaving chaotic tracks in the snow. The woods were peaceful, the silence broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional joyful bark from the pups. Grace moved slowly but deliberately, her steps careful as Clara stayed close, offering support with gentle words of encouragement. The cold air was sharp, but the sunlight streaming through the trees softened the chill. Grace paused frequently, lifting her head to sniff the crisp air, her golden fur catching the light. "You remember this place, don't you?" Clara said softly, her hand resting on Grace's back. "It's different now, safe and warm, just like it should be." They reached a small clearing where the puppies tumbled over one another in a playful heap. Clara knelt beside Grace, her breath visible in the cold air. "This is your place now," Clara whispered, "peaceful, filled with love and joy." Grace leaned into Clara's touch, her brown eyes filled with quiet contentment. Her tail wagged faintly, a gesture that spoke volumes. Back at the cabin, Clara and Millie prepared a cozy indoor picnic for Grace and her puppies. Blankets and pillows were spread near the fire, creating a warm and inviting space. Millie brought freshly baked bread and hot cider, while Clara roasted a special chicken dinner just for Grace. The puppies, ever mischievous, scampered around, their noses twitching at the tantalizing smells wafting through the room. Grace watched them with tired but affectionate eyes, her head resting on a soft cushion. When the chicken was placed before her, Grace's tail thumped against the floor, a rare but joyful sign of her appreciation. She ate slowly but eagerly, savoring each bite as Clara sat beside her, stroking her fur. "You deserve this, girl," Clara said softly. "Every single bit." The puppies nibbled on small portions prepared just for them, their tiny tails wagging furiously. Laughter filled the room as Millie recounted stories of the town's antics. And Clara couldn't remember the last time her cabin had been so filled with life and love. The next item on the bucket list was a playdate for the puppies at the town park. The snow had softened into a sparkling white blanket, perfect for frolicking. Families gathered with their children, bundled in coats and scarves, as the puppies tumbled joyfully across the snow. Grace, nestled in a warm blanket on Clara's lap, watched with quiet pride as her pups played. Buddy, the largest of the litter, took charge, barking gleefully as he led his siblings in a chaotic game of tag. Sunny and Daisy chased each other in dizzying circles, while Lucky and Milo burrowed into a snowbank, emerging with their faces dusted in frost. Clara's heart swelled as she watched the joyful scene. "Look at them, Grace," she whispered. "They're so full of life, just like you wanted." Grace let out a soft sigh, her eyes never leaving her pups. Clara hugged her gently, grateful for the moment. One afternoon, a local photographer volunteered to capture the beautiful bond between Clara, Grace, and the puppies. The cabin was transformed into a cozy studio, with the fire casting a warm golden glow. Grace sat regally on her new dog bed, her puppies nestled around her. Clara joined them, wrapping her arms lovingly around Grace as the pups clambered over her lap. The photographer captured moments of pure joy, Grace nuzzling one of her pups, Clara laughing as Milo tried to chew on her scarf, and all 6 puppies piling onto Clara in a wriggling heap. When the photos were printed, Clara placed one in a frame on the mantel, right beside the letter that had started it all. It was a testament to how far they had come and how much love they had found along the way. The final item on the list was a special roast chicken dinner just for Grace. Millie prepared the feast with love, seasoning the chicken to perfection. When it was placed before Grace, her eyes sparkled with delight. Clara sat beside her, breaking off small pieces and feeding them to the mother dog who had become so much more than just a rescue. She was family. "You've come a long way, Grace," Clara whispered, "and you've brought so much love into this place." Grace's tail wagged faintly, her eyes soft with trust and gratitude. As the days passed, Clara cherished every moment with Grace and the puppies. The cabin, once quiet and solitary, had become a place of warmth, love, and laughter. The community's unwavering support had made it all possible, and Clara knew she would never forget the kindness that had surrounded them. One evening, as the fire crackled softly, Clara sat with Grace by her side. The puppies were curled up together, their tiny bodies rising and falling with peaceful breaths. "You've given us all so much, Grace," Clara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've reminded us what really matters." Grace let out a contented sigh, her eyes closing as she rested her head on Clara's lap. The bond they had formed was unbreakable, forged in love and resilience. The memories they had created together would last forever, a testament to the power of compassion and the beauty of second chances. And as Clara sat there, surrounded by warmth and love, she knew that Grace's legacy would live on. Not just in the puppies who would carry her spirit forward, but in the hearts of everyone whose lives had been touched by her extraordinary story. The seasons slowly shifted, trading the icy grip of winter for the gentle warmth of spring. The snow that had once blanketed Havenwood melted into shimmering streams, and patches of vibrant green began to reclaim the land. Flowers bloomed along the dirt roads, their colors bright and hopeful. Life, it seemed, had found its way back after the long winter, just as it had inside Clara's heart. The puppies had grown sturdy and lively, their golden coats gleaming in the soft sunlight. Buddy, ever the leader, barked commands to his siblings as they tumbled across the yard in chaotic games of chase. Sunny and Daisy, inseparable as always, darted through the tall grass, their tails wagging in synchronized joy. Lucky and Milo, the smallest but most mischievous of the bunch, wrestled near the porch, their playful growls filling the air. And then there was Ben, the pup who had been on the brink of death but had fought his way back with a feisty spirit and determination that Clara admired deeply. He was smaller than the rest but no less bold, his little tail wagging furiously as he pounced on Buddy in a spirited ambush. Clara watched from her rocking chair on the porch, her heart full as she sipped her morning coffee. Grace lay beside her, her golden fur now soft and clean, though her body remained frail. The mother dog had given everything she had to ensure the survival of her pups, and it showed in the gentle way she watched over them, even as her strength waned. "You did good, girl," Clara murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Grace's ears. "Look at them. All because of you." Grace let out a soft huff, her eyes filled with a quiet pride that mirrored Clara's own feelings. The community had continued to rally around Clara and her little family. The Grace Fund had provided everything they needed, from food and veterinary care to toys and blankets for the energetic pups. Neighbors stopped by regularly, bringing treats and sharing stories. Children from the local school often visited, their laughter mingling with the joyful barks of the puppies. One afternoon, Millie arrived with a beautifully crafted sign. "I thought it was time for a little tribute," she said, her eyes shining. The sign read, "In honor of Grace, a symbol of love, resilience, and second chances." Clara's throat tightened as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's perfect, Millie. Thank you." They placed the sign near the garden, where flowers had begun to bloom. It stood as a testament to the dog who had brought so much love and hope not only to Clara but to the entire community. As the weeks passed, Clara knew the time was coming to find homes for the puppies. It was a bittersweet decision. They had become such a vital part of her life, but she knew it was the right thing to do. With the help of Millie and Dr. Emily Carter, each puppy found a loving home. Buddy went to a family with 3 rambunctious children who adored his playful nature. Sunny and Daisy were adopted together by a retired couple who had always dreamed of having golden retrievers. Max's curious spirit found a perfect match with a young artist who loved exploring the woods. Lucky and Milo, inseparable despite their mischievous streak, went to a local farmer who welcomed their boundless energy. And then there was Ben. "You're staying right here," Clara said firmly as the little pup wagged his tail, his eyes bright with joy. "This is your home." Ben barked happily, as if he understood, and Clara laughed, scooping him up into her arms. "You and me, kid," she said softly. "We'll take care of each other." Grace's health continued to decline, but her spirit never wavered. Clara made sure every day was filled with love and comfort. They took gentle walks through the garden, sat by the fire on cool evenings, and basked in the warmth of the spring sun on the porch. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Clara sat with Grace on the porch. Ben lay at their feet, his little body curled up in peaceful sleep. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the faint hum of crickets. "You've done your job, Grace," Clara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Your pups are safe, happy, and loved. You can rest now, knowing you gave them everything." Grace let out a contented sigh, her head resting on Clara's lap. Her eyes, once filled with fear and pain, now held only peace. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Grace's breathing grew softer until it faded into the quiet night. Clara's tears fell freely, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of gratitude for the love and joy Grace had brought into her life. "You were my angel, Grace," Clara whispered. "You saved me as much as I saved you." The next morning, the town gathered to honor Grace's memory. They placed flowers around the sign Millie had crafted, sharing stories of how Grace had touched their lives. "She reminded us all of what really matters," Millie said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Love, resilience, and never giving up on those who need us." Clara stood quietly, Ben nestled in her arms. The little pup licked her cheek, offering comfort in the way only a dog could. "You'll carry her spirit forward," Clara whispered to Ben. "Just like her pups will carry her legacy to their new homes." As spring gave way to summer, life in Havenwood continued, but Grace's presence remained ever felt. The sign in the garden stood as a reminder of her story, a tale of survival, love, and second chances. Clara's cabin, once a place of solitude, was now a home filled with warmth and life. Ben grew into a spirited and loyal companion, always by Clara's side, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. One evening, as Clara sat on the porch, watching the fireflies dance across the yard, she felt a deep sense of peace. "You were right, Grace," she said softly, her gaze lifting to the stars. Sometimes angels do appear in the most unexpected places, and with Ben curled at her feet, Clara knew that Grace's legacy would never fade. It would live on in the hearts of those who had loved her and in the joy that filled the world because of her courage and love. As days turned to years, Havenwood never forgot Grace. Her story became a beacon of compassion, reminding everyone that even in the face of hardship, love could triumph. The sign in Clara's garden stood proudly, its simple words resonating with everyone who passed by. "In honor of Grace," a symbol of love, resilience, and second chances. Clara's life had changed in ways she never imagined. The loneliness that once weighed heavily on her heart had been replaced by love and companionship. Ben, her spirited and loyal pup, became her steadfast companion, filling the cabin with endless joy. Together, they took long walks through the woods, shared quiet evenings by the fire, and embraced the simple beauty of life. But more than that, Grace's legacy lived on through her puppies, who had grown into strong, loving dogs in their new homes. Each time one of their families visited Clara, bringing tales of their joyful adventures, it was a reminder of the love Grace had passed down to them. One summer afternoon, as Clara sat on her porch with Ben resting at her feet, she gazed out at the vibrant garden, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. A deep sense of peace settled over her. "Thank you, Grace," she whispered, "for everything." Her heart was full, knowing that Grace's story had touched not only her life but the entire community, and that love, once planted, never truly faded. It only grew stronger, spreading like wildflowers in the wind. Did that tug at your heartstrings? Let us know what you think about this story in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming moments with our loyal furry friends. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Which country?